Over the past decade or so, the Marvel Cinematic Universe has become one of the most successful movie franchises, subsequently making Marvel one of the most popular brands in the world. And of course, Disney has become synonymous with this popular brand, having bought them back in 2009 for $4 billion, appearing in front of all their films and now having many shows based on them on their new streaming platform, Disney+. However, what still puzzles many people to this day is how Universal Studios Orlando somehow has a land themed to Marvel and their characters when their biggest competitor right down the street, Disney, cannot use any of the characters heavily featured there. Well, to do a bit of foreshadowing, the reason for this is from a good deal gone bad. Today we will discuss how did Universal and Marvel come to a deal that brought Marvel to Universal's theme parks in the first place, 2, what that deal entailed, and 3, how it impacts both Disney, Universal, and Marvel to this day. The year 1993. Universal is 3 years out from successfully opening their new theme park in Orlando, Universal Studios Florida. Despite many rides not working on opening day, the attendance numbers over the first 3 years far exceeded what Universal had anticipated when they first came to Orlando. As a result of this, Universal is quickly into pitching and designing their new theme park to be built right next door, making it a 2-park resort. The park went through many idea changes as far as what IPs to include throughout the park, but they knew for a fact that they wanted a superhero land once all things were said and done. However, their first choice was not Marvel, and in fact was their biggest rival, DC Comics. They wanted to bring Batman and Superman to the Universal parks. This idea actually got very far in the planning process, with several concept art pieces being made for the project. However, Universal failed to reach an agreement with DC, thus opting them to go to the next biggest player in the superhero space, that being Marvel, who at the time was not in a very good financial state. In fact, they were very close to bankruptcy. You gotta remember, this was the 90s. This was before Sam Raimi's Spider-Man. This is before the Marvel Cinematic Universe. With interest in comic books declining and their other biggest source of revenue being children's television, they really were not in a good spot, and certainly nowhere near the big player they are today. So going into this deal, you have to consider that Universal was at a much higher power stance than Marvel. Marvel needed the money more than Universal needed Marvel. So that of course brings us to the deal. The deal, which was signed in 1994, as you might notice, says that the deal was between MCA and Marvel Entertainment. MCA was the parent company for Universal at the time. Of course, nowadays the parent company for Universal is Comcast. In the first section here, which describes the project, basically the important things we need to know here is that it specifies that we are talking about a land. We are talking about a complex of rides, stores, and food venues, all themed to Marvel. The next section discusses when the land must be open by for the deal to remain valid. And as you can see by these dates here, obviously they gave them plenty of leeway here as far as when they must have it open by, as they literally said that they could start construction of Islands of Adventure by 1999. Of course, they were already open by 1999, so no issues there. On top of this, the section also lays out an undisclosed fee that Universal must pay to enter into the contract. This is a one-time fee that they had to pay just to enter into the contract. So up to this point, the deal seems pretty fair, pretty even, nothing that really benefits Universal or Marvel in an unfair way. However, then we get to the term, the length of said contract. And you can see right here, first sentence, once the Marvel Universe opens within the above time period, the term of this agreement shall continue for as long as the Marvel Universe shall remain open at any Universal theme park, except for termination for material breach. Essentially meaning that so long as Marvel Super Island is standing, this deal is valid. There's nothing Marvel can do to cut the contract short, unless Universal does something absolutely heinous with their brand. So this is really the first folly in this contract for Marvel. At the time, Marvel probably was like, oh, this is great for us, it make it more likely that they'll actually keep the deal for as long as possible, since, again, Marvel was not in a great spot at the time. But obviously, not having that opportunity to renegotiate and kind of go back over these fees, which we'll get into in a bit, will obviously come back to hurt them when the brand becomes as popular as it is now. The next part of major contention is, of course, the exclusivity rights. So essentially, the way that this would work is that Universal would get exclusive worldwide rights for the first 2 years that Islands of Adventure was open, after which they would have an option to extend those worldwide rights for another 5 years if they chose to build another Marvel Land in another Universal theme park. Doing this would require Universal to pay an option fee, as it was considered expansion of the licensing rights. Now, what's weird about this is that 2 years after Islands of Adventure opened, Universal Studios Japan opened up with Spider-Man in the park. However, there's no Marvel Land in here, and it specifically specifies here that it must be a land that is of similar size and proportion to what was built in Islands of Adventure, and obviously that's not what we got here in Japan. So I'm thinking that what happened in Japan was signed under a different deal and under different terms, because clearly what's stated here does not apply to what happened in Japan, especially considering that there's an Iron Man ride in Hong Kong showing that the rights here do not apply in Asia. Speaking of the exclusivity rights, we can see here that if Universal decided not to expand, which we're pretty much assuming they did not under these terms, that Universal would not have the worldwide rights and would instead have the rights east of the Mississippi. However, the way that this worked is that they would only get the rights to characters or families that were heavily featured within the land. Now, what they mean by family is any character that's a part of a certain team. So they list here the Fantastic Four, the Avengers. Of course, you can also throw in X-Men. And the way they defined majorly featured was essentially if they were more than just an incidental element of theming within the land. If they were majorly featured, whether it be on a ride or on a restaurant, if they were majorly featured there and were a major theme of said place, then they counted as Universal's exclusive rights east of the Mississippi. And Universal was really smart about this, because obviously the way it's worded, Marvel can kind of construe it if, they don't really want you to have the certain rights to certain characters. So what they did is they gave a ride to each one of those families. Fantastic Four, Doctor Doom, Hulk, the Avengers, Spider-Man, and of course Stormforce Excellatron for the X-Men. Each major family that Marvel had at the time is featured on a ride within that land, thus meaning that essentially Universal has the exclusive rights to the entire Marvel brand east of the Mississippi, except for Guardians of the Galaxy, who would not become major until much later on. Thus is why we're getting the Guardians of the Galaxy ride in Epcot. And if it wasn't clear by what I said earlier, anyone west of the Mississippi, aka Disneyland, Disney's California Adventure, is free to go ahead and use Marvel properties as they see fit. Does not matter if Islands of Adventure is using them or not, which obviously explains how they're able to build the Avengers campus over there. So now that brings us to the cost. And the cost, it's not pretty for Marvel. No, sir, it is not. You would think, Universal's paying up, that's going to be good for Marvel, right? No, it's not, especially when you pair it up with the fact that this deal is indefinite. The first thing they list here is the flat annual fee that Universal must pay every year to keep up the licensing rights. Of course, it does say here in the first line up here that it is subject to consumer price index adjustments. Now, the consumer price index goes up about 0.3% every year, so kind of adjusting for inflation, but overall, that fee is still probably very low for what Marvel would charge nowadays, no doubt about it. And Universal is basically robbing them blind just on that fee alone. Next is merchandise royalties. Now, there was an interesting rumor going around that's saying that Disney, aka Marvel, was getting all of the revenue from merchandise sales. I have no idea where this came from, because it's fairly black and white in this contract here that that's just not the case. What happens in this case is that Universal will pay an undisclosed percentage of the wholesale cost for the merchandise in a given quarter. In case you don't know, the wholesale cost is the price at which Universal buys their merchandise from the manufacturer. Now, the way they usually do that is they buy it in bulk, so that's how they get it for such a cheap price, and of course can sell it to the consumer for a pretty massive profit margin. So not only does Marvel not take home all the revenue, but they also only get a percentage of the cost at which Universal is buying said product for, not even how much they're selling it for, meaning that Universal can completely control how much profit margin they take home from each sale. On top of this, there's also an annual advance that Universal must pay on merchandise. Now, I don't know what that is, it's undisclosed, but I'm assuming it's probably not something that's too unattainable for Universal, because it says here that once they reach that advance, that percentage, that royalty percentage they're paying on each wholesale cost, guess what? It goes down after that, once that advance is met. So Universal is, again, making way more money on merchandise here than Marvel is by a long shot. Kind of jumping off of this, there's also a product purchase guarantee, basically saying that if Universal doesn't buy enough product from Marvel and their manufacturers, they must make up the amount that they are short of said product purchase guarantee. Another kick to the butt here for Marvel is that there's no adjustment to move this up, and there's only an option to adjust it down if for whatever reason interest in Marvel products goes down. There is not one to bring it up. Not that it would matter, because I'm sure that Universal is selling enough Marvel merchandise to meet any sort of number they put here, but still, again, just another missed opportunity for Marvel, who just was not in a good power position going into this deal. And then the last major thing to talk about in this contract is the Marvel compensation alternative, which is very interesting. It basically says that if Universal makes an agreement with another third party for a licensing deal, and in that licensing deal, instead of paying a flat fee and a royalty percentage like they do for Marvel in this deal, instead give them a percentage of net revenues or gross revenues, or base it off of attendance numbers, if they did that, Marvel would have the option to take that exact deal and apply it to their situation here. Now, this is probably the only one good thing that Marvel put in this contract that could actually benefit them. And I was thinking about it, I was like, did Universal maybe mess up here and actually take a deal that had to do with it? Obviously, looking at it, realistically, there would only be one third party that Universal would have made this deal with, and that would be Warner Brothers for Harry Potter. And guess what? That contract's online too. So I looked it up, and no. Unfortunately for Marvel, that deal is the exact same way it works here. There's a flat fee you pay every year, and then there's also, of course, the merchandise royalty fees on top of some other fees that we're also throwing there because, again, power dynamic was not as messed up as it is here. So I think it's safe to say that Marvel is still very much so stuck in this deal, and there has not been any major changes to it, unfortunately. So now, knowing all of this, how does it affect the parks today? Obviously, it gives Universal a very popular brand in their parks that they're making plenty of money off of, right? They're not really spending that much on licensing fees and merchandise deals. Like, they are making way more than Marvel is at any given moment here, and using their brand is certainly bringing a whole lot of people to the park. Now, an interesting thing that a lot of people brought up about Disney's situation is that Disney chose to honor all the contracts that Marvel had when they acquired them back in 2009, meaning that technically speaking, Disney could have ended this contract when they acquired Marvel, but chose not to. So a lot of people believe that Disney does not actually care. They actually don't want the Marvel brand that much in their parks. Couple of things. One, back in 2009, Marvel was not as big as they are now, so it's possible that maybe they actually didn't care at the time, but certainly do care now, obviously. Or, and I think this is more likely, if Disney's just out here canceling contracts left and right, it's not really a good look, and it's something that's going to not only ruin their public perception, but is also going to ruin their current business relationships, which could absolutely be burned if they see them just cutting off contracts with people left and right like that, especially when we're talking about a deal that's going to be as highly publicized and obvious as cutting off a deal with Universal where they have to get rid of the whole theme park land. Like, you can't just go ahead and do that, right? It's going to be a bad look for you. But coming back to how it affects Disney today, obviously, they really can only use Guardians of the Galaxy in the Orlando parks. There is some talk of maybe they can get around with Black Panther, but I'm pretty sure Black Panther shows up as a member of the Avengers in the comics, so I don't think you could get around that, unfortunately. And what should be interesting to see going forward is whether or not the Avengers Campus Land over in California is successful. If it is immensely successful and it's very popular and it does really well, it should be interesting to see if Disney looks into finding some way they can acquire these rights from Universal. The price is certainly going to be high. There's no doubt about that. Could they make some sort of swap? Could they make some sort of deal, right? Obviously, I don't think money in and of itself is going to be enough to get Universal to just drop it. I think, though, what could be interesting is another property that is owned by Disney that is in the Universal Parks, that being Simpsons. I think there could be some discussion around that, because the rumor is that contract ends in 2028. Unfortunately, it appears that contract is not available online, so we don't actually know the end date for that. But what could certainly happen if Universal wants to keep Simpsons, Disney can use that as a bargaining chip to say, hey, you give us back Marvel, we'll let you keep Simpsons, and we'll lower the licensing fights. Hell, we'll give it to you for free, right? Something that's got to be really sweet for Universal because they know how much that Marvel bargaining chip is worth. They are putting so much money, not only into the movies, but now obviously TV, and Disney wants to bring it to the parks. They know how successful it can be there, and they know how much money they're missing out on by their competitors using it. But we'll just have to wait and see. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think this deal is as unfair to Marvel as I think it is? And do you think that maybe Marvel could have done something better to fix the situation early on when signing this contract back in 1994 if they had no other choice? Let me know in the comments. Also, let me know what sort of deal you guys think Disney could make with Universal to get those rights back, or if Disney actually doesn't care and they're okay with Universal using it. Who knows? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you all next time. Peace.